Let's start with a question. Can a negative action lead to a positive result? Well, yes, of course. A simple example would be an individual stealing from the rich and giving to the poor. The negative action is the stealing, the positive result is the giving. But if we're going to be justifying any given negative action with a positive result, we must consider that the negative action will generally be perceived before the positive result. Because of this, we can have a negative action be net negative for some amount of time before it is balanced out. The question that follows then is, when do we make our judgment on the negative action? Well, in general, we make the judgment when it affects us or someone we care about. If someone punches me in the face, I care about it then and there, not a week later when I found out it fixed my bad neck. With all this in mind, let's get to the topic of the video. I am defining social artifacts as written, verbal, visual, or other social mechanisms used to convey information from one individual to one or more other individuals. And when I say negative social artifacts, I mean in this context, the mechanism or behavior carries with it the possibility to cause legitimate harm to another individual. In this video, I am going to go over an analysis of negative social artifacts to determine when we ought to remove any particular negative social artifact from any given social system. To start, let's take a look at a question that gets to the core of this problem. Given the percentage of the population that falls into the category of having specific or all negative artifacts affect them in a potentially harmful manner, is this amount of people a meaningful percentage of the total population in any given social system? That is to say, does it affect enough people in such a negative way that we deem any particular negative actions either immoral or from a practical lens dangerous to the sustainability or any other arbitrary goal of our system? My argument from this question is as follows. If there is some meaningful percentage of individuals interacting with the given social system at any given moment in time who are at or between a single short experience of significant vulnerability to some specific or all negative actions, a commonly occurring experience of significant vulnerability to some specific or all negative actions, a general or constant experience of significant vulnerability to some or all negative actions, then there is a meaningful percentage of the total population that can be harmed by negative social artifacts. The reason I broke this down into the three categories seen here is because there are many who would argue that we should be invulnerable to negative social artifacts. These arguments generally state that there is a significant number of individuals who do not experience harm from negative social artifacts. These individuals posit that the removal of these negative social artifacts is mostly for clout or false signaling to some or many powerful groups. The reasoning then follows that those who happen to experience harm from any given social artifact have the individual responsibility to remove themselves from the social space instead of limiting the freedoms of others within this space. Although I actually agree that in many situations this can be true, I think people pull up this argument in many cases where it is not true. To counter the points I have mentioned, I break down the possibilities of when any individual might be vulnerable to make clear that we aren't just talking about consistently vulnerable individuals who, by the previous argument, should remove themselves from these spaces, but we are also considering individuals who typically would not be harmed but just so happen to be at this point in time vulnerable. So now we find ourselves with two questions, an easy one and a hard one. The easy question is as follows. How does the percentage of human individuals interacting with a given social system who are at or between the previously outlined vulnerabilities change throughout time? Well, the answer is that we have no good way of determining how this percentage changes. There may be some general trends we can track through social engineering, but getting any specific percentage is incredibly difficult, if not impossible. Therefore, when considering negative social artifacts, we must now weigh out the risk that there might be some percentage of individuals who are vulnerable at any given moment in time. But we can claim that as the population of the social system increases, we would expect the total number of vulnerable individuals at any given time to increase. As we increase the population, we increase the number of actors who could at any moment possibly be vulnerable. Therefore, again, we must weigh out the risk there might be some percentage of individuals who are vulnerable at any given moment in time, especially when the social system includes a very large and diverse population. The hard question is as follows. What percentage of the total population that will be affected is meaningfully large enough for us to push for changing the occurrence of any particular social artifact? This is a hard question because we have to ask ourselves a few things. What is that percentage of people? How meaningful is the impact on that percentage of people? And from this, is the cost of removing the social artifact worth this removal? Clearly, for any given particular social artifact, the argumentation would be unique to that social artifact within the context of the social system we are talking about. But in general, I would posit that even at a low percentage of our population, we would care, particularly when considering large diverse populations of humans interacting with one another. The internet as the most obvious example. My arguments for this are as follows. My first point is that many of us can think of individuals who are at a specific or habitual vulnerable time in their life. More broadly, I understand humans to be much more malleable and influenceable than some of our stereotypes might imply. The vast majority of us have functioning hardware that allows us to experience the neurological and additional physiological effects one might have when they're emotionally vulnerable. Certainly everyone's hardware is tuned a bit differently. In fact, we must even acknowledge that some are tuned in such a way that they have no emotional color at all. But there is this toxic idea that the vast majority of people aren't in some particular way affected by the words, messages, and/or sentiments we interact with ad nauseum in contemporary life. I just don't understand how this can be true if so many of us clearly contain the hardware described. My second point is just that as we increase the population of the social system, a smaller percentage of that population becomes more significant. So 0.1% of 1,000 people might not be that big of a deal, but 0.1% of 1 million people is a considerable population that is being affected. Consider that nearly 2 billion unique visitors visit YouTube alone every month. 0.1% of that population is the size of a small country. Given any particular negative social artifact that is being viewed by a significant number of these people, the percentage that are at this point in time vulnerable is probably a significant number of people. A good way of imagining this is to consider the percentage of that 2 billion that is under the age of 18 and is viewing content that could be potentially harmful. This is just one of many demographics that we must consider when weighing the risks of any given negative social artifact. But I can imagine still that some will strongly argue that many specific negative social artifacts are not going to change any given amount of individuals for the worse or harm them in any way that's significant. But clearly, we must ask, what percentage of the population does this actually reflect? I have two arguments for why that percentage isn't as large as some may argue, or rather, why the more important stat that we asked previously, the percentage of people that are meaningfully harmed by any given social artifact, is large enough to desire change in our current environments even if many people are not affected by it. The first is simply that in contemporary life, we experience all forms of media at very amplified and consistent rates. This, of course, includes the category of negative social artifacts. Therefore, the percentage of the population that is affected by the negativity is going to increase simply due to the amplified and consistent negativity impacting individuals it would not normally. My second point is that it is very difficult to detach ourselves from this negativity. Unfortunately, a lot of this negativity is baked into our culture, our daily tasks, the entertainment we use, and behavior in the figures we trust. This is not to place blame on any particular actors or category of actors outright, but instead to simply acknowledge that the shape of our society has molded the actors within it in some particular negative ways that are amplified in social systems. Let's take a step back from the reasoning and broad statements. Here's a simple example of a negative social artifact that is being justified by some plausible positive outcome. We're going to analyze the outcomes of the example to get a better feel for the problem. Person A says to person B, "Eat less food, fatty." The plausible intention, often a justification or learned behavior, is to get the positive outcome, person B losing weight. I bring up intention here because it is important. If there is no justification, learned behavior, or genuine deeper intention to help person B, then how can we say that the negative action's moral judgment is the same? We must consider that in general, any action that carries some magnitude of negative outcome without some self-justified, learned, or intentional positive outcome whatsoever, by most definitions, is immoral. So if I don't at least pretend, or convince myself, to be trying to get some positive outcome, then the negative action is clearly an immoral one. We must also consider not just the morals, but the second part of the original question. Here we look at the possible practical consequences of the negative actions, where in particular we ask if these actions affect enough people in such a negative way that we deem these actions dangerous to the sustainability, or any other arbitrary goal, of our system. We care from this lens only about how the actor's behavior changes after harm has been done to them. Does this harm cause in general a benefit to the system, or does it degrade the system? Well, if we discover that there is some justification, learned behavior, or intention to act in a way that harms another individual, who in turn degrades the system, we would be compelled to find solutions to preventing either the forces or the platforms that cause people to create negative social artifacts. So, moving forward with the example, let's look at the broad possible outcomes of the negative action. The best outcome is as follows. Person B does go on to lose weight as a result. Person B is not part of the meaningful percent of individuals interacting with the given social system at this particular moment that are harmed by this particular negative action. The next best outcome is this. Person B does go on to lose weight as a result, but person B is part of the meaningful percent of individuals interacting with the given social system at this particular moment that are harmed by this particular negative action. The third and fourth outcomes, which are worse than the first two, are as follows. Person B doesn't go on to lose weight as a result, but person B is not part of the meaningful percent of individuals interacting with the given social system at this particular moment that are harmed by this particular negative action. Person B doesn't go on to lose weight as a result, and person B is part of the meaningful percent of individuals interacting with the given social system at this particular moment that are harmed by this particular negative action. From these outcomes, I highlight the negative outcomes as red, the neutral outcomes as yellow, and the positive outcomes as green. As a note on the coloring, we must recognize that they are from the lens of the justification or intention of the negative action. Some may argue that they did not lose weight is a neutral outcome, but from this lens, we must recognize that the outcome is good or bad dependent on the justification. So for example, if we feel we are justified in calling someone fat because we believe it will cause them to lose weight, we must recognize that if they do not lose weight, that is a bad outcome, as our desired outcome is for them to lose weight. So now the question is about probability. What is the probability that the outcome of any given negative social artifact impacts all other individuals within this social situation as a net positive outcome? In this specific example, there is only one outcome that on its face appears to have a net positive effect. Any other outcome from this analysis results in some negative impact on the receiving individual. If the chance of all other outcomes besides the net positive one is significant, then we ought to question whether there is legitimate reason to allow the given social artifact. Now, to be fair, the outcomes described previously are simplified. In reality, there are other outcomes of any given artifact, and as such, the outcomes are never as cleanly portrayed as in this example. But it does give us a rough understanding for what kinds of outcomes we should be considering in the distribution of the negative/positive net outcomes. From here, we can start considering specific negative social artifacts that we ought to remove and how to do so. Based on this analysis, the negative social artifacts I would like to see reduced in our social systems are as follows: misinformation, harmful comparison, divisive rhetoric. I feel that these social artifacts are generally immoral and in many cases cause a degradation of our broader social systems. If I was to ask myself, is there some meaningful percent of the population that is legitimately harmed by the described artifacts, I would say yes for each of these. It is obviously not 100%, but even 1% of the internet's population being affected by the 3 artifacts described can have major real-life consequences. Of course, the other side of this discussion is the value of freedom of speech. But I hope that many have recognized that the purpose of this analysis is to illustrate the nuance that is required when considering the impact specific social artifacts have on large diverse populations of people. To simply say that all social artifacts should be allowed because of the principles of freedom of speech seems to me to be too simple of an understanding. In fact, it sounds outright dangerous. I am a huge proponent of freedom of speech, and I think it's a freedom that every person is rightfully owed. But I don't think as a society, our institutions, both private and public, are obligated to amplify hateful, harmful, or false narratives. Unfortunately, these voices will always be present in our societies, but it is our duty as friends and neighbors to ensure the spaces we exist within are healthy and sustainable for the majority of individuals within them. This doesn't necessarily mean that we have to start censoring or removing individuals from these spaces, but rather we should prioritize engineering our social systems to promote empathy, respect, and inclusion without compromising the freedom to express opinion. The difficulty here is that this is not in the interest of those who currently build these systems, and even if it was, it comes gradually and over time as more people get on board with it. But we can all start this process right now. A lot of people who probably agree with me up to this point unfortunately go about this in a toxic way. It's not about telling someone to change their behavior, it's about deciding for yourself to have more respectful conversations and engaging with others in a way that is meaningful. I don't think any of us have ever had their opinion changed because someone yelled at us through Twitter. It's also super important to recognize that you don't always need to be in conflict with those who are harmful. A big problem with good ideas that are counter to the cultural narrative is that instead of recognizing the difficulty in trying to convey experience or understanding that provides this new idea, individuals will focus on ostracizing and harassing those they don't agree with. Have you ever tried to teach someone something new? Let me tell you, the moment you call them stupid is the moment they never listen to anything you have to say again. Another important aspect to consider is that every time we reply to what we perceive as a harmful social artifact, we are becoming part of the system that is propagating that harmful artifact. The social systems we interact with are not engineered to give us what's going to make us better people. They're only concerned with keeping us engaged. If we are often engaged with harmful rhetoric, then not only are those harmful discussions in a way continued, but the system will recognize this and continue to give you harmful rhetoric that we will then continue to spread. My solution is not to let harmful rhetoric go uncontested, but to hopefully let it get drowned out by positive and meaningful rhetoric with those who are genuinely willing to engage. Clearly, this isn't always the solution, and there are many hypotheticals and real-world situations that require more direct action. But I believe that the balance in online communities is far and away from what it should be. These spaces aren't just text boards to shitpost on every now and then. Many of these spaces have become a significant portion of people's lives, and we will no doubt see this continue to increase. It is in our best interest to start the process of reworking these systems to be more sustainable and functional for all of humanity. I want to end this video by extending an olive branch to those who might disagree with me on this topic. Assuming that my analysis works for negative social artifacts and we can agree that some should be reduced or outright removed, the next most important question we all have to ask is, how do we know when we've gone too far? Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.